Hi, everyone. I'm Margaret Karrass, and I teach numerous. So I am going to talk to you a little bit about persuasion and argumentation and why it matters. And I'm going to talk to you about my numeracy course. And perhaps I can convince you that, how does this work? Okay, this way.
Yeah.
Doesn't.
Use the trackpad.
It doesn't. Oh, okay, it does. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the course I teach and how argumentation and persuasion fit in. And we're going to talk a little bit about how students engage in the activity of argumentation. And then hopefully I will be able to convince you or explain why it matters. So first of all, numeracy course, let me digress for a moment. So Aristotle thought that people have to engage in three lives. And these three lives involve the life of leisure, of course, the leisure class, and the life of productivity and the life of contemplation. So in our modern world, we address the two because we're so involved, so engaged with digital technology. And it does marvels for our leisure. We get entertained beautifully, and for our productivity, because we're able to handle all sorts of activities of professional activities with digital media. However, the life of contemplation, I would say, suffers a bit. So numeracy, as I see it at UTM, is there to pick up the slack. So numeracy in terms, is a term used to identify knowledge and capabilities required to accommodate mathematical demands of private and professional and public life. We want to be able to empower the learner to engage in civic discourse. And in order to be able to do that, we want our learners to be able to use their mathematical knowledge and aid as a tool, as a mathematical tool. So Ernst said that once mathematics becomes a thinking tool for viewing the world critically, it will contribute to both the political and social empowerment. And I entirely agree. So numeracy has been defined, we're trying to understand what numeracy is. It is sort of work in progress. And the reason is this, historically and culturally, some define numeracy as simply being able to work with numbers, understanding quantities, which is incredibly important and challenging. However, numeracy is much more than that. Numeracy, according to PISA, my dissertation advisor insisted that it's PISA, not PISA. So forgive me if your pronunciation is different from mine. So according to PISA, there are 6 factors involved, or 6 characteristics of numeracy skills, and among them, there's mathematical argumentation, mathematical communication, representation, and symbol. Now, there are others like problem solving and so on. I have not included, although very important for this presentation, I have not included this. Now, so we will think of, I think of numeracy more so than just ability to work with numbers, but actually as a mathematical literacy that becomes a tool for working and living, and of course, entertainment. Now, to make a case for argumentation, these erstwhile researchers do an excellent job. I am not going to bore you with everything they said. You can read it. I would like to get to the project I'm working on. The only thing I'm going to say is that argumentation allows students to make their thoughts available for conscious inspection. And because of it, it engages students in contemplation. They learn to formulate their thoughts and express them. And very often, it is a very challenging task. So I thought of this idea a couple of semesters ago because the course by itself is not incredibly challenging. And the majority of students that are in the course are computer science students, mathematics students, geography students, and so on. And they are in their, very few are in their first year. They're mostly in their second, sometimes third or fourth year, because the course intellectually perceived is not very difficult. It's not really mathematics. And so students take the course and believe that they're going to fly through it. And I had to find a way of communicating with students in such a way that I would actually understand and they will actually gain some skills after the numeracy course. And so it dawned on me that if I engage them in conversation, then first of all, I will be able to understand what they know. And secondly, if they will be able to think of what they're saying or what they know, think deeply of what they know. So eventually, this semester, I was introduced to Tolman framework because there has to be a way of systematic organization, of organizing this dialogue, this argumentation dialogue. And so Tolman framework works quite well. It was developed by, for those of you who are not familiar, was developed by British, I'm sure everyone is familiar, by the British philosopher, Stephen Tolman. And in 1958, he wrote a book. And in this book, he talked about a framework for analyzing and constructing arguments. Some believe that Tolman's framework is the dominant theoretical tool for analyzing argumentation. And the research shows that it is particularly constructive for short written arguments. However, in this project, we're talking about written argumentation and oral argumentation, and I will explain in a moment why. So this is the general framework. This is a full framework, and I looked at the full framework and the partial framework. The partial framework, the partial framework would include, would include grounds, it would include qualifier and claim. Sometimes it would include grounds, warrant, qualifier, and claim. And a full framework for this particular project would include all components, except possibly for rebuttal, because for this particular problem that I'm going to show you, there was no evidence of rebuttal. Okay, so this is the problem. This is their second assignment in argumentation. And it is courtesy Keating. Thank you. So this is the problem I assigned. A newspaper headline reads, "A driver is involved in an accident every 6 seconds." The question is there anything wrong with this headline? And the job of a student is to persuade their partner that the headline either makes sense or it does not. And there's some additional information given. We use symbols to denote X as a driver, T as a 6-second interval, A of X comma T denotes the property X is in an accident during interval time T. And this is what they need to do. They need to express the headline in symbolic form as it is written. So however the symbols represent a driver's involved in an accident every 6 seconds. Then rewrite the headline so that the literal form has the meaning that the writer intended. And then students have to submit their written argument and then record their oral argument without looking at the written text they produced. So that's the condition. They're supposed to rehearse their argument and then record it and submit both. Now, the purpose is for the students to identify the difference between two statements. There exists X for all T, where A of X comma T, and then for all T, there exists X and so on. So they're supposed to work on it for a week and then submit. And I'm going to tell you about the results of this. Okay. So it's not enough for students to do this. They need to be able to convince their partner. So after they have worked on the Tolman framework, they've learned Tolman framework, and they worked on the problem, they have to submit, a written argument and an oral argument, but also they have to exchange with their partners their oral presentation, their oral argument. So they exchange recordings. The partners now need to identify elements of the Tolman framework in each other's recordings and decide whether it is a partial framework or a full framework. So they need to identify the components of Tolman's framework. They need to be able to answer the following questions. Is the Tolman framework structure preserved? Is the argument persuasive? And do you agree with the partner's claim? Now, they need to complete a questionnaire now to answer these questions, and then they have to exchange the feedback and submit to me their conclusions. So it is an involved process, but it works quite well. So I'll tell you about the population. So these are my students. The academic level, about 53% of them are in the second year. 27% is in the year 3 and 4. I have 60 students, and 54 of them responded. So I have 54 responses. These are their majors. They major in geography, science, commerce, computer science, mathematics, and I have a few others like psychology and so on. Now, these are the courses they have. They are taken now or they have taken before. And because the majority of students are in their second year, they have taken either a mathematics course, a statistics course, or several mathematics or statistics courses, or computer science courses. So all math majors and computer science majors, because it's the same department, they all take proofs. The majority of them take calculus 135, 136. Some of them take 133, which is math for commerce. It's calculus and linear algebra for commerce. It's a year-long course. And many of them take programming and introduction to computer science, and then computational probability and statistics. So this is my population. Now, after they have submitted their work, this is what I found. So in blue, on the first graph, in blue, this is what I looked at their work, and I marked it for full or partial framework. So if they gave me the grounds and the warrant and the claim, I would say it's a partial. And if they included anything else, if there was a qualifier and so on, I would say it's a full framework. Now, in orange, yeah, six of them did not, they submitted their argument in mathematics notation. There was no argumentation there. There was no explanation, no language written at all. There's no claim. All of it came in symbolic form. It was discounted. So now, the student submissions, when they exchanged with their partners, so they thought that 24 gave full had full framework, and 30 had partial framework. Now, how is it significant? It's not, but the idea, well, it is to a certain extent. It's important to see whether students really understand the framework itself. So the difference is not great. They sort of understand maybe a little bit, but maybe not. So we need to continue working with the framework. However, the interesting results came after they looked at each other's work. They listened to each other's work and they assessed and gave each other feedback. So this is what we found. Some answers were correct, some answers were incorrect. Some students say they were persuaded and some said that they were not persuaded. The interesting thing is this. So 11, when the answer was correct, they assessed it as a full framework and they were persuaded. 14 said it was a partial framework, the answer was correct, and they were persuaded. But the interesting thing is this, 4. So even though the answer was correct, they came up with the correct answer to the problem. Their partners were not persuaded. Now, another interesting one is this. Even though the answer was incorrect, they were not persuaded, even though they recognized that it's a full framework. 7 of them said it was a full Tolman's framework, so the argumentation had to work, but they were not persuaded. Now, and of course, 16 of them, even though the answer was incorrect, they were persuaded. Now, so this is a little bit of percentages and the general comments. Correct answer, and students were not persuaded. So the reason they were not persuaded is because the answer was incomplete, or it was a partial framework. And so they thought that because it's a partial framework, or because of the framework, because it was incomplete, then the answer is incorrect. Or the answer is correct, but they were not persuaded. It was not persuasive enough because the framework was not followed. Not persuaded because did not follow the instructions. Okay. Now, incorrect answers. And they were not persuaded, of course, because the argument does not matter. If the answer is incorrect, it is incorrect. And not a complete framework. So the partner got it wrong. because it's an incomplete framework. But the most interesting one is this, is the incorrect answer, but they were persuaded. So persuaded because partners supported their claim by using the framework. So the answer must be right. Or they were persuaded because I remember it from Math 102. Even though the answer is incorrect, the student had internalized a particular symbolic expression. And it's a mistake, it's a misconception. It's not a typo, it's a misconception. And so because they remember it erroneously, they were not persuaded, even though the answer was correct. So they didn't really look at the argument itself. They did not really study deeply the symbolic representation of it. And finally, persuaded because I think these two formulas mean the same thing. So there exists X for all T, or for all T there exists an X. They thought that they're equivalent. So the follow-up questions. If the argument does not, and these are the questions I am offering students to follow up on this exercise. So if the argument does not precisely follow Toulmin's scheme, should we not trust the claim? So if the scheme is incomplete, even though you know that it's correct, should you not trust the correct answer? So these are follow-up questions to ask. Now, why does it matter? So these are the difference between, I've recorded some of these and transcribed some of these. And this is what students said. So in a written statement, therefore, while the headline may be sensational, so this headline is sensational, it is not nonsensical. It is a dramatic way to express unfortunate regularity of car accidents. So with all that background, we're saying that it is not, it's not nonsensical. Yeah, that's an interesting, so Olga, right? So they didn't think it was nonsensical, where in fact it is. Now, another written statement is they're equivalent. So because A x of x comma t is equal to A of x comma t in both statements, therefore there exists x for all t, and there exists and for all t there exists an x. They must be the same, but they're not. So the second expression thus provides a more generalized explanation of the idea provided by the writer. That's a really interesting explanation. Now, in oral statements, it gets even more amazing. So one can spend years analyzing this. In mathematics, symbolic expressions are precise, but in English, the same thing can be said in different ways. So the question is, how do linguists study? How do we study the natural language? How do linguists do it? Linguistics is a science. So I believe they both capture the same meaning behind the headline. At least there is consistency in this statement and this statement. So this is between written statement and oral statement. So there is some consistency here. And the first expression is a bit ambiguous, and it may or may not be true. So how does one, so what's the problem here? And the problem clearly has to do with symbolic nature of mathematics we teach. We teach symbolic expressions, and it goes back all the way to, beers and benches and beer mugs, points and lines, benches and beer mugs, you can call them anything you want and you can do whatever you want with it. However, there comes a point when the meaning is lost entirely. And our students are able to manipulate algebraic expressions or abstract formulas, and yet they cannot interpret them or they cannot put them in words. And so that's why numeracy matters. That's why we need to teach it. That's why that's the objective, and this is the goal. This is the reason for our existence. And so limitations. Limited data so far. This is just the beginning. I'm sure they will get better by the end of the semester. The students' language proficiency is an issue because I do have many English as a second language speakers, and that is an issue, and one has to be able to sift through this and tease out their ability to argue. Selection of problems is a challenge. One needs to be able to find really things that students can construct arguments, and there are simple problems are simple enough and yet illustrative enough to do this. So a challenge is a more accurate assessment of Toulmin framework. My 2 cents in everyday English sentence, the context can be, it's true. And then waiting for funding. Well, I applied. Let's see if they will give me money. It's important to develop a better assessment tool for Toulmin framework. And there is I recently read, and I didn't have a chance to study it well, there is this geometric way of understanding Toulmin framework. And so the plans, my plans are, I will reassess the project at the end of the semester, and I'm going to tweak it, and I'm going to run it again the following semester because I think it's important. And if people want to read about this stuff.